What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Cricut Innovate E5G and go over everything you need to know about the device to help you decide whether or not it's right for you. Now, the Cricut Innovate E5G was released rather recently, and when I originally saw this phone, I was sort of expecting it to be a newer, more improved version of the Cricut Dream 5G that came out last year in late 2021. Now, as you can see in my video comparing those two phones, that ended up not quite being the case, but I still do think this phone does have its value. So we're going to go over its specs and features so you can decide for yourself whether or not the Cricut Innovate E5G is worth buying for you. Now, as always, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get right into it. So with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we are getting a pretty decent display here. At 6.6 inches with a 20:9 aspect ratio, the phone is on the larger side, which is a good thing if you're going to be on it a lot. It also has a taller and more narrow form factor, which is going to give you a more immersive experience in landscape mode and a better scrolling experience when you're doing something like browsing the web or using social media. Now, the downside here is that despite having a larger display with great dimensions, we're only getting a 720p resolution. And while the image quality is okay for what it is, it really doesn't look amazing, and there are better options out there if all you're doing with your phone is consuming content. The other thing with this display I don't particularly care for is with its rather basic LCD display technology, the viewing angles and overall brightness really aren't the best. So if you're in a brighter room or maybe outside in the sun, it's going to be quite a bit harder to see than other phones with higher quality displays. So in general, if you want a decent display for occasional video streaming, web browsing, social media, or something like that, there definitely are worse options out there, and I do think the size and dimensions make this phone a decent option for what it is. But at the same time, if you're constantly on your phone watching videos, playing games, and doing things where the image quality is more important, I do think you can easily get a phone with a much better display without having to spend too much more money. Now for storage, the Cricut Innovate E5G has 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so really not bad here, especially considering this is a relatively low-end phone. But that being said, keep in mind, while 64GB at one point in time was considered a pretty large amount of storage, at this point in 2022, it's really more of a minimum. For the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, it should at least be okay, especially with microSD card expansion to offload stuff like photos and videos. But if you're more of a heavy user, if you typically have a lot of apps, for example, especially games that take up a lot more space, you might want to consider looking at a slightly higher end device that has more storage, because again, while 64GB in this price range really isn't bad, at this point in 2022, it's really going to be more or less the bare minimum of what's acceptable. Now for security features, this phone does have face unlock and a fingerprint scanner, giving you two options besides a pin to unlock it. This is a nice thing to see because there are plenty of phones in this price range that only have one or the other. For that matter, the Cricut Dream 5G that came out last year doesn't have face unlock, so if you want both options, definitely keep this in mind. The fingerprint scanner is on the back of the phone in a more classic spot, and as far as functionality goes, it is real fast and responsive, so I honestly have no complaints here. Now, one area where phones in this price range are typically lacking in is the camera. With the Cricut Innovate E5G, on one hand, the features aren't particularly impressive, with a 5-megapixel selfie camera in the front and a dual camera consisting of a 13-megapixel main camera and a 2-megapixel depth sensing camera in the back. The setup here is pretty basic, missing features like an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera that are really useful if you're taking a lot of photos on a daily basis. But that being said, despite not having a ton of features, the photo quality you get with this phone for what it is really isn't too bad. I kinda underestimated it actually. While the camera quality won't be nearly enough for those of you who are seriously into mobile photography, for more casual camera users it will be perfectly fine. So if you just need to take a couple regular or portrait photos every now and then, maybe to share on social media for example, while the Cricut Innovate E5G obviously doesn't have the best camera in the world, I would say it will at least get the job done. For video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K here, which really shouldn't be surprising. I don't think I've ever seen a new phone in this price range that can record in 4K, but other than that, the video quality, just like the photo quality, is pretty decent for what it is. If you're recording maybe a vlog or a YouTube video where you really care about the quality, then yeah, maybe go for a higher end device with a better setup overall. But for more casual use, especially for something like Snapchat for example, where the quality doesn't really even matter, this phone will definitely get the job done. Now, so far you've probably noticed for the most part this is a pretty mediocre entry-level phone. It's definitely not bad for what it is, but there's also nothing really special about it. That being said though, its biggest strength definitely has to be the processor. With 4GB 4GB of RAM in the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. We're not only getting 5G connectivity with this phone, which is already impressive for this price range, but the performance in general is just really good. Sure, it's obviously nowhere near as fast as a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, but for a $150-something Cricket branded phone, the Innovate E5G's performance is quite a bit better than you might expect. For basic daily activities like web browsing, social media, even some mobile gaming here and there, everything does run well and you can expect to get a good experience. But that being said, keep in mind again, this is an entry-level device and phones like this can really only be so fast. So if you're constantly on your phone doing higher performance activities like playing Call of Duty or something, in that kind of situation, you're probably going to be able to justify spending a bit more to get a higher end device. But in general, for what it is, I am impressed with this phone's performance. For the battery, this phone is, while not bad, definitely not the best either. With a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging, I wouldn't call this an amazing choice for those of you who are maybe traveling a lot or in situations where you're not around a charger for at least part of the day. But at the same time, a 4000 mAh battery isn't exactly small either, so in general, if you're not too concerned about battery life, but you want it to be at least decent, then you most likely will be at least satisfied with this phone. Another thing to keep in mind here is that the Cricket Innovate E5G does not have wireless charging. The reason I bring this up is not because I expected the feature in any way, but because the Cricket Dream 5G, which is basically the big brother of this phone, does actually have wireless charging, and seeing how a lot of these phones really just kind of blend together, it might be easy to get these two confused. So if you do care about wireless charging, keep in mind, the Cricket Dream 5G does have it, but this phone, the Cricket Innovate E5G, does not. Speaking of other features, one thing the Cricket Innovate E5G does have is NFC, which is definitely good news if you like to use tap and pay. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, but I do think that makes this the most affordable phone that has this feature. Unless the A03s has it, I don't think it does. But regardless, if you are looking for a really affordable phone that has NFC, and you happen to be a Cricket user, then this phone of course is a great choice. In addition to this, we are getting Android 12 with this phone, and while I'm not expecting any major updates, at least it does have Android 12 and not Android 11. Blue, I'm looking at you. Yeah. So if you are a little flexible on the software, maybe you don't care about having the latest version of Android, but you'd prefer to have something at least decently newer, then the Cricket Innovate E5G will still be perfectly fine. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Cricket Innovate E5G. Like I said in my first impressions video, honestly my opinion hasn't really changed a whole lot. This is basically just a slightly newer version of the Cricket Dream 5G but with fewer features. Now if you want to hear more about that, definitely check out my full comparison between the two phones. But aside from the performance, which is again really good for what it is, the Cricket Innovate E5G is essentially just a generic entry-level phone that's more or less interchangeable with several others in its price range. Is it a bad phone? For an entry-level phone, absolutely not. But is it special in any way? Aside from, again, the performance, it's really not. But of course, that being said, if you just want a phone with 5G connectivity and a fast processor, there's really absolutely nothing wrong with this phone. And in addition to this, I will admit, I really did underestimate the camera in my first impressions video. I honestly wasn't expecting the photo quality to be nearly as good as it ended up being. So at the end of the day, if you're looking for a solid entry-level phone with a decent display, 5G connectivity, and plenty of power for basic activities, and you want a camera that doesn't necessarily have a ton of features, but does take decently good photos to share on social media or something like that, then the Cricket Innovate E5G will be a good option. Now again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.